MythVision. I'm excited about tonight's show because I look up to both the gentlemen you see on the screen today. They're academic scholars, they're just the way they carry themselves, and being open minded to venture into areas most people are not. And both scholars I have today are Dr. M. David Litwa and Dr. Dennis R. MacDonald. They told me not to refer to them as doctor from this point forward to keep it friendly. David and Dennis, I can't promise you that that's going to happen. I get an autopilot, so forgive me up front, but welcome to MythVision, gentlemen.
Exactly.
Thanks so much, Derek.
Thank you, and thank you to the audience who's tuning in. I am not going to take the time to go through the long intros. I do want everybody who's watching, if you haven't already got a copy of both of their works, seriously, I highly recommend it. My old bookshelf over here, I'm not even going to point it. I've got 10, 12 books of Dr. MacDonald's work. Just love what he's doing. And Dr. Litwa, I think I have 4 or 5 of yours so far, and I'm collecting them now as we speak. I've got some on ebook too, but I want the hard copy. I got to be able to throw it at somebody, let them know how I really feel. I want to introduce you both real quick with your credentials. I'm going to start with Dr. Litwa. In his area of expertise, and just so people know, is in Greco-Roman religions, Philonic studies, Gospel and Pauline literature, heresiology, Gnostic and Nag Hammadi studies, ancient philosophy, ancient mythology, deification, theosis, ancient esoteric movements, in particular Greek mystery cults, ruler worship. And of course, he has PhD. Dr. Dennis R. MacDonald has wrote endless, just books since what, the 70s, Dr. MacDonald?
The 80s, yeah.
80s. Okay, and you were the John Wesley Professor of New Testament and Christian Origins at Claremont School of Theology in California. Do you have your emeritus from there? You might as well by now.
Yes, I do. Yes. Yeah.
Okay, awesome. One day I expect Dr. Litwa is going to have the same of where he's coming from. And of course, you proposed a theory within the earliest books of the New Testament were responses to Homeric epics, including the Gospel of Mark, Acts of the Apostles, and the methodology you pioneered is called Nemesis Criticism. And if your theories are correct, nearly everything written on the early Christian narrative is flawed when it comes to scholarship on this idea. So I want to start on common ground between. Did you want to comment on that before I get into the common ground?
No, that's fine. No, that's fine.
I figure why not start on the even playing field where both of you agree. And what I find unique about your scholarship is both of you aren't looking only to the Hebrew Bible to figure out what's going on in the New Testament. There's much more at play here, and how Hellenism has impacted, however you want to put that, the Jewish world. Can both of you, or would you care to elaborate and tell us, building up to what's going on in the New Testament times with Jews? Because we like to think it's black and white. You've got Jew and Gentile, and Jews are this wholly separate. They don't get impacted by Hellenism, and they're not thinking in Greek ideas, etc. But that's not what both of you gentlemen do. Would you care to start, Dennis?
I think we swim in the same river, which is different from what you're going to find with lots of scholars in the guild. But I think we have come from 2 different sources to that river. And at some point, we need to find a happy way to talk about those different sources. But let me start with some admiration. I only have one of David's books, and it's clear that he's a serious scholar and he's done wide-ranging and imaginative work. And he recognizes analogies between Hellenistic mythology, Roman mythology, and the New Testament, some of which has been seen in the past, but much of it has not, and it's not been conducted in the same way. One of his commitments is then to see what kind of history or bios a gospel might be. And he coins a genre designation of mythic historiography or something similar to that. The stream that I come from is more classical Greek poetry. And so I'm interested in Homer, the Athenian tragedies, and so on. So we'll be able to talk about that. The implications of that are quite important, Derek, because I don't think that the Gospels are mythic histories. I think they're community formative documents that are struggling against the poetic script provided especially by Homer and Virgil. So I think that's where we're going. I've actually prepared something that probably is premature to give now, but I'd like to, at some point, tell you what my understanding of resistance to Nemesis criticism has been, and very briefly my response to it. Because in my reading of David's work, about 3 of these 5 categories or so pop up in his treatment of Nemesis criticism. I do have a question for David before we go further, and I would like to get his response if I've properly characterized his work. In what I saw, David, I didn't see anything about Q. Are you a Q agnostic, or?
I'm a Q eliminator. I don't think it's necessary. Yeah, but we should talk more about that. But I wanted to address also Derek's question that when we're talking about my model, I would call generally dynamic cultural interaction, which is to say that Judea, before Alexander the Great, and very much so after, was a Hellenized region. And it was a region that had undergone, in other words, the process of cultural diffusion, which means that if you can use an analogy here, America has exported its culture across the world, okay, and not, some of it is high culture, some of it is quite low. It's McDonald's and Kentucky Fried Chicken here.
Hey, careful about McDonald's.
But I mean, and I love fast food here, but all that I'm saying is that through music, through technological products, through apps and social media, America is the great exporter of its culture. And in the time of the New Testament, Greece was the great exporter of culture. English is the lingua franca today. Greek was the lingua franca in Jesus's time. And we can tell that Judea is a highly Hellenized place by looking at the pottery, by looking at the theaters, by looking at the architecture, by looking at the painting, by looking at the sculpture, by looking at all forms of cultural media in which you see cultural diffusion. And another key term that I'll throw in here from sociology is socialization. We are all socialized in a particular cultural matrix. And that cultural matrix was, for lack of a better term, Hellenistic for almost all people in Judea. That's still their cultural matrix. Now, within that cultural matrix, you can form a distinct subcultural identity. So Jews are fiercely Jewish. And no, I certainly don't want to deny that. Jews of today, Jews of in Jesus's time, they're fiercely they're pro their own identity, but that's a subcultural identity. They belong to a more generalized cultural matrix, just as an extreme Orthodox Jew in New York City belongs to American culture. They may have systems of resistance to oppose the broader culture. But for most Jews, they accept some level of integration into the general framework, the cultural framework. And that happens through socialization. And socialization is just walking out the street and being influenced by anything and everything else in your world, okay? So that's how this stuff goes on. So the dynamic cultural interaction is more than just reading texts. It's interacting with culture on any level whatsoever, with eyes, ears, type of food that you see, the theater productions, okay, the music you listen to, the things you see architecturally. Okay, so all of that is coming in at 1,000 miles an hour, and it's coming in, to Jews in their own homeland. Okay, but Jews are also in the diaspora. They're in the center of of Hellenized areas like Alexandria, Corinth, etc., Rome, etc. So yes, absolutely, Judaism is a Hellenized religion.
So
That's not an attack on Judaism.
No. Yeah. And both of you are in agreement here. And I definitely think we're already in the deep end. This is exactly where we're going to see agreement as you part in different methodology. But I want our audience to see that. I want to see two scholars who can be friendly and have a conversation about this disagreement and where you disagree and why. But also it shines a better light where we, non-academics like myself, will be able to point at. So I know we're ready to go in and go ahead and deal with this, but my question is, do we get any super chats real quick? Or do I preserve these for the end after we have like 30, 45 minutes and then we have the super chats?
Either way, I mean, I think people should have as much time to ask as possible. But if Dennis has a short presentation, I don't really. But
no, it's not a presentation. I think it's just a conversation. I just want to make sure that I'm not interrupting you guys.
Well,
Sure.
Let me respond to David while you're looking for the chat, and I'll shut up as soon as the chat comes up. David, I agree with everything you said. I do not have problems with socialization. I don't have problems with multiple forms of cultural dissemination. But I would say that literacy and literature is one of them. And so the question is, how do we test whether cultural dissemination has only non-literary vectors, or is there a place for mimesis? And I would insist that in terms of the Gospels, mimesis is in fact the primary vector of Hellenism, where you express more skepticism about that being the primary vector. I don't see that you, I wonder sometimes if you dismiss mimesis altogether as a possible vector of Hellenism.
Nope.
But I know that you're skeptical about the criteria that are used to detect it. At least that you say that in your book on the Gospels as history. So no, I don't disagree with you, and I think it's good to start on this plateau. We are in the same river, but we are going to we come from different sources of our understanding of where that is.
Okay,
Sure.
so real quick, if I may, real quick, we're going to hold off on the Patreons and the Patrons, the super chats till the end. I really want you both to get into this, if you don't mind.
Sure. Well, I Heraclitus said you never step in the same river twice. So, I think that being in the same river means that we bring variation. And I think that there's a lot of light that can be generated from that. Basically, for me, and mimesis is depends on the criteria of analogy. And for me, analogy is never genealogy. So, but it also comes down to interest. I'm not that interested in proving genetic connection. I'm more interested in just letting the light shine through analogy. I would say, however, that I've done for the past 2 years most of my work in the 2nd century, and so I'm what I see in the 2nd century is something that I don't see in the 1st century, and that's where Christians start to cite Homer directly and actually to quote him. So in the Exegesis of the Soul, which is Nag Hammadi,
Yeah, right.
and you have quotations from the Odyssey 1 and 4. In the Nassenes, they quote Odyssey.
Yeah, that's right.
24, and then you've got the Simonians. The Simonians, followers of Simon of Samaria, are
Helen.
said to allegorize Helen and her torch.
That's right.
Which is actually it's not actually in our epics, but it's that Homeric lore. So eventually you do see the genetic interaction with Homer. And I sort of, the more I read this, my hypothesis is that takes time to have that direct genetic interaction. And that seems to be coming from, for lack of a better term, an Alexandrian cultural mentality. I put exegesis of the soul in Alexandria. I put the Nassins in Alexandria. I'm a little bit confused about where the Simonians are. But I do think that Christians eventually get around to doing that kind of definitely provable and demonstrable genetic connection and what you're calling mimesis. And I absolutely am willing to see earlier Christians also interacting on a more general level with Homeric ideas and ideology. But I guess it just comes down to interest. What I see is that there are so many more cultural influences generating the Gospels that I think, although I'm quite open to mimesis as long as we have good criteria, and I think you've got decent criteria, we also need to be open to mimesis on a bunch of other levels. So not just...
Absolutely, yeah. I don't deny that there are other cultural factors, and you talk about some of them in your book, and I find them to be useful. And you say in your book that probably the most formative author of Hellenistic culture is Homer, and that was in the schools and so on. So you don't deny that. The issue is, how does one test whether particular narratives of early Christianity issue from, and by the way, I want to stop there because I'm going to use the word generic or genetic that you also used a couple of times. And I just want to make sure that the viewers understand what the difference is. A genetic connection between two myths, let's say those in the Gospels and those in Homer, is a literary connection. So you have one text parenting another. So the genetic or the genealogical trope works. You're more interested, without excluding the other, in a generic understanding of cultural dissemination and similarity. And I don't think it needs to be an either or. And I actually try to do in my more recent work a dance around the differences between a generic and a genetic approach. But I still think the generic approach is the most productive.
I agree. I agree with all that. Yeah. No disagreement there. And I think that, where most of the light comes is in scholars interacting as groups and really, coming together and talking about what is in the general matrix of the literary culture. What are the gospel writers really interacting with on a whole number of letters, or a whole number of ways? Sorry, are they going to the theater? Are they seeing artwork? Well, they must be on some level. Are they seeing sculpture? Do they visit temples? Paul says that some Corinthian Christians are eating banquets in the temple, so they have to be seeing the artwork. They have to be seeing the sculpture. They have to be. Of course. Yep. Some of them are reading, not all of them, but they have to be going to the theater. Even Philo goes to the theater, and they have to be going to the race course. And they're being bombarded with these cultural images, so that even it would be impossible for them not to be influenced in that sort of way. They would be blind and deaf. Right. So scholars need to get together and to say, what are the most plausible interactions, and that it can't just be one person saying that I think there's a genetic connection here. It has to be, well, what do you folks think, and what's and why, and does that seem plausible to you? And classicists need to be invited into this conversation too.
Absolutely.
because classicists,
Absolutely.
New Testament scholars aren't familiar with mythology, and classicists aren't that familiar with New Testament. So really, the best
Absolutely.
controls is that more general conversation. And the more we can do that, I mean, that's really where we are on the same team. I mean, the more we can create that more dynamic academic culture where we are not siloed off,
That's right.
and that would be an immense success.
It would. I have another question for you that isn't intended to be probing. But Robin Faith Walsh has recently written that we've dumbed down the evangelists so that because they actually were much more among the Pepe than many, and the educated and elite and so on, and they were more in control of their materials than we usually think. And one of the criticisms, and you mention it a couple of times in your book by Kara Olaf Sandnes, is that the gospel authors were not sufficiently educated and sophisticated, and certainly their readers weren't, in order to be able to detect and benefit from mimesis. Do you have a position on that question?
Yeah, I mean, in general, I think Robin's headed in the right direction. I certainly think that the author of canonical Luke is on that high end of literary proficiency, but I also think that there's a range. So I mean, there's a difference in texture and between, say, Tacitus and the Gospel of Mark or the Gospel of John. But that doesn't mean that difference in texture doesn't mean that, one of them is sophisticated and one of them is not sophisticated, because the ability to speak plainly and profoundly is itself a mark of education. And I think John especially has been greatly underestimated in terms of his historiographical nuances. And Chris Keith is working on a book on this, focusing on John and historiography. So I think that they're absolutely all fairly sophisticated authors, but for whatever reason, the literary products that they create, and I'm thinking especially of Mark and John, read at a level of, at the level of texture. They read much differently than Suetonius and Tacitus. So I'm interested in the question of, why is that? And frankly, I don't have a good reason for that, but I do consider them more or less intellectual and educated equals.
Yeah. Okay, that's fair enough. Okay.
So, gentlemen, both of you seem to agree on both positions in a way, where Dennis is definitely saying it's all coming in at 1,000 miles an hour. However, I'm seeing literary imitation. Dr. Lit was saying, I'm seeing mostly the 1,000 miles an hour, cultural, everything in the vision around every street corner, you name it. And maybe you're not seeing as much, I suspect. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you're not seeing as much literary imitation, but you're not closed off to literary imitation being a thing. Is there an example, if I can crisscross both of you gentlemen, to still man the opposite side in a way? Dr. Lit, was there anywhere that you can think of that you might say, you know what, I think that might be literary imitation in the New Testament? And then the same question to you, Dr. MacDonald, would there be something in the Gospels or in the New Testament that you wouldn't mistake for literary imitation and would say, this is the 1,000-mile-an-hour cultural imitation probably taking place rather than literary? Dr. Litwell, we'll start with you, and then Dr. MacDonald next.
Well, so with the Gospels, I think the beginning and the end of the Gospels are the main, those are the high voltage sites for highly mimetic activity. And another way I'm more comfortable just describing it as those are the most highly mythicized sections of the Gospels, and for obvious reasons, because when you get into the resurrection narratives, you're getting into essentially what is unknown. And I think basically all that the early Christians knew about the resurrection, in terms of a historical event, ended with Mark 16, verse 8, where the women came to the tomb, there was nobody inside, and they ran away terrified. And that's it. And so that's all that Christians knew. And so when later gospel writers try to fill in the blanks, and we definitely know that happens because somebody writes a new ending to Mark. In fact, they write 2 new endings to Mark. And when that happens, then they have to be using mimetic resources, because in a sense, all that they have are maybe their own visions and traditions that have been passed on orally, but they've also got this rich cultural repertoire of what is Jesus's resurrection like, and they can use, say, well-known stories like Romulus's ascension, which is also a violent death, and some people think it's a violent death. You've got Asclepius hit by lightning, and you've got Heracles who's burned alive but also ascends, and these rich cultural stories that the Jews, like Josephus, had already been conforming their Jewish heroes to these other rich cultural sort of archetypical stories. So Josephus, for instance, when he writes the death of Moses, he basically conforms him to these disappearance narratives and these translation narratives, so that essentially Moses translates out of this world more or less like Romulus. But Josephus is rather sneaky about it and says, but Moses didn't want you to think that, lest you think that he had been, retreated back into the divinity, is his way of putting it. But of course, Josephus does want you to think that Moses is a greater hero than Heracles or Romulus or Asclepius or whoever. So I think it's an interesting move, and I think that's the same thing. And I would say very much the same thing with birth narratives. I don't think Christians historically knew anything about Jesus's birth. So that's where mythicization or mimesis, it becomes in great use to Christians, and they've got lots of models. Again, they get the birth of Moses, they've got the birth of Augustus, they've got all these other birth stories that attract certain elements, some of them a bit stereotyped, and then the stories get filled out over time. So definitely there is mimesis there, if that's what we prefer to call it. Absolutely.
Well, I wouldn't call that mimesis, David, because you're still talking about general cultural interaction. So just the Lucan infancy narrative, in my view, is an imitation of the Homeric hymn to Aphrodite, when she seduces Anchises and then promises there'll be an eternal dynasty that comes out of their union. And for Luke at the end, of course, Odysseus comes home. He demonstrates who he is by his scar. And then Jesus actually quotes Anticlea in Odyssey 11 by saying, flesh and blood does not have, the soul does not have flesh and blood. The UCI have is Luke's version, and Anticlea's is that she does not have flesh and bone. It's the same wording. So that's a good example of where one of us will look for a mimetic connection to a text that exists, and another, and you would prefer to hear it as a cultural dissemination. Generic.
I have to say, though, it's still beautiful because both seem compatible in this way. While Dr. Litwa may not be looking for that literary, right, and you may see that, he's like, it's there, though. It's happening. And Dr. MacDonald's seeing this in the Greek and going, I'm finding this. It seems like they're literarily connected. Even if Dr. Litwa like stops short and says, well, I don't go to the literary, right, but I see it in the culture. Both of you guys are so close. So
well,
close.
No, it could be. I wouldn't deny Dennis's theory, but I would also just say that's just one vector, as he's put it, whereas there's a whole kaleidoscope here. And why just limit it to that story? In other words, I think where the real disagreement is I don't think gospel stories are constructed out of one other story. I think they're constructed. They enter the human imagination, and the human imagination is so big and so broad and so varied, and incorporates so many different and diverse streams. It's like a vast tapestry where you've got 1,000 different threads, and Mark is just working out, and he's not just looking at the Homeric thread. The Homeric thread is in there, sure, but there's also, what we think of as classical mythology is just the bread and butter of these people. And they've got any number of stories that they might be working with to generate a product. And
okay, let me respond to that, David. I agree with you. And Luke obviously is indebted to the Septuagint at the same time that he's, with his enunciation, he seems to be imitating this hymn. So, and there's also another thing that students were taught, and that's eclectic mimesis. That is, you imitate multiple models to create something new. And the image that's sometimes used, it's like a bee that goes from plant to plant in order to collect the nectar to make the honey, which is not identical to anything that you have in the nectar. But I want to take the challenge that Derek gave and throw it back. The part of your book that I found most compelling has to do not with Luke and Mark, but with Matthew. And it's something other people have explored, but I think you articulate it very well. That is the Magi and the Star. And there's an example of where we do not have a good widespread textual display of it. You have to piece that together from the various pieces of the Alexander birth and so on. So in that case, I would say you don't have mimesis, that it's most likely that you have cultural radiation. Now, the one chapter where I had the most trouble, David, is how you treated the death of Jesus in the context of martyrologies and so on, because I think it's an extended imitation of the death of Hector from Iliad Book 22. We can't get into the weeds of that, but Derek asked me to identify a text where I found your work to be helpful and compelling, and I'm willing to go with it. And it was that one on the Magi and the Star, which I'm sure you're pretty proud of.
Well, I mean, so in that chapter, that's a good example, though, of where we differ. So I totally see the logic of going to Homer, because he's probably he's the superstar, but I just don't see why we would, in a sense, stop there or only focus on there. So I for the Magi and the Star, I look at Mithridates, and Mithridates,
yeah, sure,
is a historical figure, but he's also he's experienced mythicization, and it's a successful mythicization. And then that very successful mythicization is then recapitulated and adapted. And I also use Plutarch. So in a sense, I mean, yeah, I just feel like I don't at all exclude that Hector is in the death stories of Jesus. I just don't. But I don't know why I would stop there. I mean, in the sense that you've done a fine job making your case, but there is so much more going on. It's just where I am. So I don't even view it as oppositional.
Okay.
Gentlemen, this is really fun, and it makes me feel like we have so much we could really, if we wanted to get in the weeds, could. We do have a lot of super chats if you're interested in going there.
Good. Sure. Yeah, let's do it.
I want to say thank you to everybody in the audience for the support. Obviously, if you're here, you're definitely a deep thinker. There's nobody here who's not actually paying attention, who isn't realizing this is heavy scholarship that we're dealing with. And of course, you're past the realm of fundamentalism unless you're trolling in the chat. So let me go ahead and get us started here at the beginning. You know, I gotta say hey to my friends out there, you know, that totally disagree. Gnostic Informant, if you haven't subscribed, you're probably going to Hades, Gehenna, I don't know, one of those horrible places. Be sure to do so. And when we get done with this live, jump over there because there's going to be an episode we're going to not want to miss. Do you think the Naasene Preacher's Hymn shows us that the ancient Romans were looking for a savior archetype in which Jesus and Adonis fit the role? And whoever wants to start off first, go for it. And then when you're done, we've got many more to go.
I have no idea.
Yeah, I can give a stab at it. I think everyone should know the Nacenes, and everyone should be familiar with what's called, or what has been called, the Nicene Sermon. And the Nicene Sermon is so important for this question of mimesis and cultural imitation in general, that because the Nicene preacher is the most eclectic absorber of Greco-Roman cultural information, but he's also a Christian. And so he brings in Homer, he brings in Anacreon, and he brings in Empedocles, he brings in all different people in his cultural environment, and he quotes them. So he doesn't leave you hanging. I mean, there's nothing really to detect here. He says that Jesus is the Logos, but the Logos is also Hermes. And if you look in Odyssey 24, where Hermes is leading the suitors down into Hades, he says the suitors represent the people who remember. And here he's punning because he's thinking etymologically of what the Greek means here. Menaster, that mene root is a root of memory. And so he says, I'll tell you who the suitors really are. They are those who remember their origin. And so it's a complete reversal of Homer, but it's also because Homer, you know, doesn't want to save the suitors. I mean, the suitors are going down to hell, but the Nicene preacher wants to save the suitors and say that they are the ones who remember and that they are followers of the Logos, who is Hermes, but he's also Jesus. So that's the kind of cultural interaction that the Nicene author is willing to take you. And he does think that Jesus, the Logos, is represented primarily in the figure of other Greco-Roman mystery deities, which would include Adonis, which would include Attis, which would include Osiris, which would include, he brings up the Eleusinian mysteries, he brings up the mysteries of Samothrace. I'm a little bit hesitant to use the word archetype. Essentially, this is a Christian author who's reading all the Greco-Roman world as a sign and symbol system for his own Christian ideology, and is willing to take not just from the Septuagint, that is from the scriptures in Greek, but from anywhere and everywhere, to show you that Jesus is the sign, the sacrament of all Greco-Roman culture, I would say. And that's really what he's trying to do, in my opinion.
Wow.
Good.
Yeah, really well done. Thank you for the answer. I love the chuckle, Dennis. That was really cool. Doc Ploromanot, thank you for the super chat. What potential classical influence could Socrates have on
Socrates?
Okay, I'm thinking who's Socrates, but anyway, have on gospel writers given his reworking of the Pentateuch into Homeric style dactylic hexameter, dating and access difficulties conceded. Now,
it is Socrates. No, it is Socrates.
Oh, it is.
Socrates is
Okay.
an unknown Hellenistic Jewish author who composed apparently dactylic hexameters in the Homeric style. And unfortunately, we don't have anything from him. We have a note about him that Shia Cohen has unearthed. And it probably is only the tip of an iceberg of such centos, or that's what I would call them, of the Pentateuch done by Jews. But it's a very good allusion to how mimesis works on Jewish texts.
Thank you, Doc. You know, I feel like he asks these questions just to see me trip over my tongue, because it's just he's definitely smart. So thank you so much, Doc, for that super chat, the support, the questions. Everybody in the chat, of course, always rooting us on here. The Gnostic Informant is back. He didn't get enough gnosis the first time, and he said, for Litwa, do you think it's just a coincidence that Euryclea means far and wide, and Jesus' feet are anointed like Odysseus, who Jesus says she will have fame far and wide? In fact, this is one of the things I must admit that Dennis's work just absolutely made me go, wow. I saw the woman at the feet, saw the scar on Odysseus' feet, recognized her master. Of course, the woman recognizes Jesus as her master, anointing him before death. And he's saying her message will be far and wide, the same meaning of the Greek word for the name of the woman that Odysseus, you get the point. Do you think that's just coincidence, or do you possibly think that Dennis might be onto something with this particular pericope?
Nope, nothing is coincidence when you're writing, because you intentionally write everything, and when you're composing something, whether or not you are subconsciously aware of it or consciously aware of it, there are things that end up being taken in from your cultural matrix and being put into your gospel. And I'm totally happy to concede. Well, it's not a concession. I'm totally happy to say that the light that Dennis has shed on this passage is legitimate light here. And this is definitely a nice little vignette for the strengths of the mimesis paradigm. And I certainly don't want to take anything away from that.
Thank you. Wow. Thank you so much for that. I really do appreciate it.
Thank you.
That.
Yeah.
Doc Ploromonad is back with the jet science language that I have a hard time reading, a fringe view. But could Jesus' commonality with the mythic heroes be explained as a sort of self-directed ostension to a new Moses, a la John the Baptist emulating Elijah? After all, Derek did interview the real Ozzy Jesus. Thank you, Doc.
Let me come at that, if I might.
Sure.
Off camera, David and I talked about Q, and he said he's a Q eliminator, and I'm a big Q fan. And this question is really quite fascinating, because if my reconstruction is correct, Jesus is depicted as a new Moses. The law and the prophets were until John. After that, the kingdom of God is in force. And the story about Jesus forgiving a sinful woman is in my reconstruction of Q. And what Jesus is writing is the same legislation in Deuteronomy that the elders would use to kill her, but he's putting it in sand to indicate that it's negotiable. And this is one reason why the Q document also has Jesus breaking the Sabbath to heal or to allow his people to harvest grain. Now, I don't think the historical Jesus had that kind of chutzpah, if I could put it that way. But I think one can say that in the sociology of Palestine before the Jewish War, there was lots of controversy about the law and its legal application, and those who suffered because they couldn't enforce it. They couldn't do it. For example, soldiers would be an example. Women in the household would be an example. Some people who had physical disabilities. And so I don't know that I would say anything that is in the New Testament comes from Jesus. But I do think that the Q document and Paul and in the James passage in Josephus, Jesus is postured as being a challenge to the legal enforcement of Mosaic law. And others came by to say that he's the new Moses who is humanizing the law. Whether we can say Jesus himself had those pretensions, I really think is not possible to know. But I think Doc is right in saying that the new Moses appears very early in the gospel tradition, and it can have some understandable historical roots.
Thank you, Dennis. I appreciate that. You want to go ahead and continue?
No, that's it.
I mean, you want to say something on that, and then I'll continue to a new super chat?
Oh, well, can I just add just a brief footnote? It's interesting that in the 2nd century, early Alexandrians like Carpocrates apparently used the John the Baptist passages to prove that actually John the Baptist was a reincarnation of Elijah. Because it's not just that
right.
John the Baptist.
That's
it's
right.
not just that John the Baptist comes in the spirit and power of Elijah. It's that Jesus says he is Elijah, and so for them, they weren't thinking mimesis; they were thinking actual metaphysics. That metaphysically, the soul of Elijah was in John the Baptist.
Yeah.
So there would definitely be some similar behavior.
Yeah.
Thank you guys so much. Scott Daniel, Dennis, your explanation of mimesis in the Emmaus Road story effectively clenched my disbelief in gospel reliability. Thank you for your work.
Oh, thank you, Scott. But I also hope that it didn't clinch your disbelief, but it clinched your admiration for the literary creativity of these people. And I think David and I are in agreement that these are works of art, and they need to be taken in as high culture of what Christians are trying to do with the literary and cultural Hellenism they're contending with.
Do you know his Emmaus Road experience, mimetic connection there, Dr. Litwa, or you haven't really heard of that one yet?
Oh no, I've heard of it. I'm a bit rusty because well, first of all, Dennis has so much that I can't possibly read everything, but
right.
I'm just a bit rusty. But I'm happy to talk about it.
Well, I think
it is a wonderful contribution, and although I remain agnostic as to whether there is anything historical in the Gospels, I think maybe a slight difference between me and Dennis is I think, maybe not, but I think that the Gospel writers wanted to sound historical. They wanted to be believed, not disbelieved. And for thousands of years, they have been believed. So in that respect, as history, so in that respect, they were successful.
Do you think that the Gospels, real quick, before we move to the next one, Dennis, the author's genius, if you will, was trying to convince its readers of histories, but they're creating these literary products that they hope their readers would think are histories?
In my view, they're not writing to convince people that these are histories. They're trying to position their hero over against the heroes of Greco-Roman culture, and they use mimesis as a way of crafting that, what I would call synchrosis. By the way, it's interesting that David published his book on the Gospels in a volume called Synchrosis. Synchrosis simply a Greek word for comparison, and it often involves invective of one person and encomium on another. And I think much of mimesis is, in fact, synchrosis. To say that Odysseus was recognized by his wounds, but Odysseus never died. Jesus actually died and came back and was recognized by his wounds. Therefore, by synchrosis, Jesus's feat is more powerful than Odysseus's. So I think this is a good example, David, of how we would differently come at this.
Well, thank you. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. Either way, the conclusion is people took it as history. So whether you could read and, you know, come to that conclusion, it is both merge. I mean, we agree. It ended up becoming that. Makes me wonder, as we move on to the next one, of them talking about they're speaking in parables, but the people who were really enlightened and saw the truth, they weren't like Dr. Price calls them the couch potatoes in the pews, or the pew potatoes, he calls them. They just don't get it. They need the face value, basic story. They don't really get the depth that this is. It makes me wonder.
Well, I don't want you to have to do this again, Derek, but one of the things that we have not talked about, that whether you go with David's model or mine, the Gospels went through a process of rigorous rehistoricizing. And there are a number of things that happened in the transmission and reading of these texts that contributed to them becoming more historically believable than the mythic history model that David uses, or the mimetic model that I use. So I think it'd be very interesting to see how we variously assess the historicizing reception of these texts until we get to Irenaeus, let's say.
Yeah, maybe so that's a definite difference. So what I mean by mythic historiography is historiography. The Gospels are historiography. They are intentionally written as a form of history. Okay, that's quite different than Dennis. They are trying to convince you that a man, Jesus, existed in the real world, in a real place, at a real time, and they thought that that was important for salvation. And the other thing that I'll just throw in here is, yes, absolutely, I agree wholeheartedly with Dennis that the Gospels are, if I'm understanding him right, presenting Jesus as in competition with these other great, and it's defeating these other great Greco-Roman heroes. For instance, Romulus, Asclepius, Hector, Odysseus, whatnot. But I think that also it's important to recognize that other Greco-Roman people view their heroes as historical. There's not a single person in the ancient world, I think, who would say that Odysseus didn't really live, or that Romulus didn't really live. I mean, a Roman would say that Romulus is a historical figure. A Greek would say that Heracles is a historical figure. And all the stories, if you're an intellectual, you can't believe certain elements of the stories. For instance, that, Heracles brought up the Hound of Hades, or that Theseus fought a Minotaur in a giant maze. You might not be able to believe that, but you could believe the historicized version of the myth, which is that Theseus really went to the island of Crete and he really fought a guy named Taurus, which means bull, and he really was in a prison, which was called the labyrinth, or a maze, and he really did get the girl in the end and live, well, not happily ever after. But so they believe that Theseus is a real dude. They just think that the stories told about him have been spiced up a bit too much.
Well, we need to talk about Lucian at some point. Lucian of Samosata. Sure. I'm a big fan of his satires, and I'm not sure he'd agree with you, David.
Well, I think Lucian is what makes Lucian funny, right? Is Lucian, like many others, is making fun of stories that just seem too unbelievable, right? And there's a certain cultural level, like held by someone like Plutarch, where Plutarch is an honest believer in myths. There's a great book written in the 80s. Did the Greeks believe their myths? And absolutely, in my opinion, they did. But they also worked with exegetical or interpretive practices to make them believable, right? So yeah, Plutarch spends a lot of time trying to, in his Life of Theseus, trying to show you that, yes, it's absolutely plausible to believe that Theseus was real, a historical dude, an Athenian hero. You absolutely should venerate and honor this guy. He's real, but you can't believe everything. And when Lucian is writing, this is not too far out, beyond Plutarch, he likes to make fun. of the fact that these stories are actually completely unbelievable. And I'm thinking particularly of the true histories, where he's just making
Right.
fun of these people who go to the island of
Right.
the blessed, or he's making fun of people who take a trip to Hades, like Odysseus, like Theseus, etc., like
Yeah.
Heracles. And he has great fun doing that and shows you that you can't believe these myths at all, I think, is
Yeah,
Lucian's
I was
myth.
translating the Mimesis, Menipus today, and the Lover of Lies. So there you have it. You have it in that area too.
Sure, absolutely.
Thank you, gentlemen. Moving to S. Duck. Thank you for the super chat. Big fan of all three men and Gnostic Informant. Neil, love you, brother. Thank you for your extensive work, gentlemen. Thank you. Thank you for the support and the compliment. KRSV2473. Thank you for that super chat. Do we see these same types of adoption with contestation among ethno-religious groups who are encountering cultural and imperial colonization today?
Absolutely, you do. Absolutely, you do. That's a very good analogy.
Maybe you want to give one example, and then we can. I don't know if you can think of one.
What about Hispanics in North America who are trying to reclaim their cultural heritage despite the colonization of Europeans in Central America and the Southwest of the United States? So there's adoption and contestation. The sociologists would talk about it as accommodation or contestation. And absolutely, I think, by the way, I'm a big believer in a different sociological theory, namely social identity theory. And I think social identity theory goes a long way to understand how you have contested cultural moments and why you have such vilifying of outgroups and glorification of in-groups and the glorification of certain leaders, like Putin in Russia, you might even say. So in the demonization of Ukrainians in the media. So I think this observation really is just the way humans' cultures are wired.
Thank you so much for that. I want to get through these because I have 15 more minutes or so with these wonderful gentlemen. We're making history tonight here at MythVision. I mean that. This is really, you gentlemen take this as like normal, but I'm sitting at the feet of gods when it comes to actual scholarship. And that's how we view it. We really appreciate your thinking, the time you guys put into this. So thank you so much. I want to let everybody know I will try my best to get through all these super chats. And I put the little banner down below to not super chat any questions, just in case I don't get through them. And I don't want you mad at me. So Battler, is it Yushiroma Mia? I apologize. I'm probably butchering that. For Dr. MacDonald, any ideas as to why an education on the classics was not stewed in New Testament studies, despite the influence of Greco-Roman world on early Christianity and Second Temple Judaism being well known?
Well, that actually is relatively recent. There was more interaction between classicists and biblical scholars in the 19th century. But one of the tragedies of the 20th century was the rise of anti-Semitism. And the Christians were involved in the Holocaust. And so there was an effort to recover Judaism and Christianity as fraternal twins and not as competitors. And if you take a look at the reference works that came out in the field of New Testament studies, they were heavily invested in, say, Greek in the Septuagint, or Hellenistic Judaism, or there was, by the way, classical education diminished a great deal in the 20th century generally. So it wasn't just the field of New Testament scholarship, but there was a fear, I think, among some, even if it wasn't articulated, that emphasizing too much of the classical world would undermine the importance of the Jewish-Christian relationships. By the way, I'm going to tell you one really brief story. I was in an elevator and someone at a professional meeting recognized my name at the elevator. And the couple were saying, we wrote an article on your work, the Homeric epics and the Gospel of Mark, and we were excited about it. And we gave it to Bible Review, and Herschel Shanks wouldn't publish it. And the reason was that it wasn't Jewish enough. And so I think there is, to some extent, and this is be an example of it, a conscious re-Judaizing of the discourse.
Wow, thank you so much for that. I really do appreciate that. Doc Ploromanot, is the baptism in Mark 1:10 being drawn from Jewish scripture misapplied? If we shift focus away from dove to bird similes, there's more in common with Greek or Persian arrival departures of gods.
Absolutely. Athena takes the form of a bird frequently. And I argue that not only is the baptism of Jesus similar to the enthronement of the unction of a prophet, but it's also similar to young Telemachus finding out who his father is, because Athena flies to him like a bird and flies away like a bird. I mean, this is in Odyssey Book 1. I think it's pretty clever.
Yeah, and I love that one where you talk about it, and then Telemachus goes back to the suitors and he lets them know who the hell he is.
That's
and he
right.
lets them know. And next
He's
thing
claiming
you know,
his kingdom.
Yeah, and then Jesus gets empowered, right, by this dove spirit that flies down upon him. And then they're going, who is this guy? Don't we know his mom and his brother? What the heck got into him? It seems like there's something there. It's just really interesting. Thank you so much.
I want to add, though, as a question to David, and it's a statement to you and your viewers, which I think David and I would agree on. The working in these fantastic texts can be so much fun and so creative. And neither of us would argue that we have found all the gems that there are in this discourse. And one of the things I would encourage people is to break away from a literal way of understanding these texts and understand them as dynamic cultural exchange.
Thank you, Dennis. I really appreciate that. Sobek, Lord of the Four Corners, always good to see you here. Love the questions you bring too, and thank you for the support. Please discuss the conception of a divine intermediary incarnating in historical figures, i.e. Logos, Moses for Philo, Hermes, Augustus for Horace, and how these Horus, and how these king lawgiver figures and particular deity. If you don't mind, Litwa, could you start?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Jason. Nice to see you, or Yason. I think that, incarnation. It was often said, or it's often still said by apologists, that incarnation is something like a unique Christian theological idea, and that it's their little piece of mythology which they guard, very vigorously, and look around them with eyes narrowed against any other story. But yeah, I think that Philo helps, and Philo has always been helpful because he is obviously vigorously Jewish in terms of his social identity, right? He'll die in a ditch for venerating Moses, and he tries to depict Moses. I think Philo's Moses is a human figure, but at the end of his life, that he becomes a deity. Philo, if you look at the life of Moses 288, it's as if Moses is put into a centrifuge, and his physical body is whirred out and deposited on the bottom, but his nous, or his mind, his divine mind, becomes bright like the sun and rises as a new star out of this world. And I think that's definitely deification. But I think for Philo, on the level of incarnation, that's a more interesting question. And that's a question I've approached recently in my book, Post-Human Transformation in the Ancient Mediterranean World. I think that Philo thinks that Moses is a daimon or something daimonic, has something like an angelic soul, a pure soul, which didn't need to be incarnated, because for most Greeks, or for most informed by the Pythagorean heritage, you're only incarnated, or I should say the Platonic and Pythagorean heritage, you are only incarnated if you need purification. You know, this world is a kind of training ground for your moral improvement. But there are certain souls that are incarnated who come down just to help us. And we find this also in Hermetic literature with Isis and Osiris. Isis and Osiris, they don't need to be incarnated. Their souls are pure, but they come down as salvific figures to help us. And then they go back to heaven after their mission is complete. And I think that's basically how Philo views Moses, that he's an incarnation of a daimonic or an angelic entity. And Philo explicitly says that daimones are the same thing as what he means by angeli or angels. So we have that helpful remark. And I think Moses is one of those persons, and that he graduates into godhood. Now, I've been criticized for bringing up the Augustus and Horace in the book, How the Gospels Became History, because, you know, this seems to many, if any of your viewers know Horace, he has this poem in which he's thinking about, you know, what god does the Emperor Augustus incarnate? And, you know, he thinks about Mars, and he raises a couple other options, but then he settles on Mercury or Hermes. And he's like, I think you incarnate Mercury. And I do so for a variety of reasons. And I mean, to me, this is as much an incarnation as really anything else is, because it's not that Hermes only temporarily inhabits Augustus. It's that he is permanently in Augustus. I mean, that's the impression that Horace gives. People can disagree with me, but that's just the impression I get from the poem. Now, it is a poem, and Horace is well aware of poetic license, and he's also well aware that he's, you know, being subjective and on the fringe. It's not like anybody else says that Augustus is an incarnation of Mercury. I mean, no, Horace is completely unique in saying that. But it's also a way to honor Augustus. All of that is true. But I think that, you know, we can't just say, that's poetry. But I think that we need to say that, you know, this is a real expression of devotion. And maybe on some level, Horace did believe that Mercury inhabited Augustus. And we should take that seriously. Or, you know, I mean, it's not, the poetic license has to mean something. In other words, is where I'm headed with that. But there are better examples.
If I may, real quick, is Augustus Prince of Peace? If I understand that.
No,
right?
It's the Emperor. The Emperor.
No,
the
I just
Emperor.
didn't know if he was called Prince of Peace at all.
I don't remember.
He brings
Pox.
Peace through war, and that's what he says in his Res Gestae. But I'm not sure he ever gets that official title.
Are you saying that he did not come to bring peace, but brought a sword? I'm just kidding. Anyway, all right,
peace through a sword.
Thank you so much. We got to move on if we're going to get through these. I don't want to leave you guys on here too long. Alan Bird, the New Testament is written in Koine Greek. This is a Dennis question. The classics in Attic Greek. Did Hellenized Jews know Attic? And would this have made literary imitation less likely, Dennis? It's a good question.
I'm having trouble with my earplug. So
you want me to repeat?
No, I can read it. Oh, the issue isn't just Attic Greek, it's also Archaic Greek, and that would have been Homeric epics. And it did make imitating Homer and Hesiod very difficult. And students really hated to have to learn this Greek that nobody was speaking in their world. But they did have exercises in taking Homeric models and using lists of Koine equivalents. There's a famous lexicon written in the 1st century of the Common Era, similar to the Gospels, from Apollonius Sophista. And it was a crutch for students who wanted to read Homer to find out the equivalents in Attic Greek. And we know that copies of this were even in Egyptian villages, so it was widespread. And what apparently happened is if the teacher said to a student, I want you to write a shipwreck story, go ahead and look at Odyssey 5 and notice a lot of the vocabulary of ships and so on, and go for it. So it did make it more difficult, but there were in schools opportunities to compose in Koine what they had read in classics. There's a rhetorician of the first century BCE who said, who could deny that the writing of prose is dependent on archaic poetry? And so this was taught in schools. Now, that doesn't mean that what's going on in the New Testament is mimesis, but it does mean that mimesis was taught in the school, and this very insightful question is there. Yes, it was difficult to imitate these things in Koine, but they were taught how to do it, and there were resources for doing so.
Thank you so much, Dennis. I do want to give a recognition here to join Dr. David Litwa's Patreon. He is trying to grow that online education. You personally message him, access a really expensive book for free and much more material. So please consider joining his Patreon. It also gives him incentive to want to come back on MythVision. So if you enjoyed these episodes, you are participating in making these possible. All right, moving on, and I will mention that at the end again, but KRSV2473, does Dr. Litwa think a layperson would get anything out of the attending out of attending any of the IRCI symposium in April other than his? Any of the talks unmissable?
Well, that's an interesting question. So the IRCI is, I belong to an Institute of Religion and Critical Inquiry, and we are having a symposium in April. And yeah, I would highly encourage anyone to come along and get what you can out of it. I'll be offering a paper on the origins of Christianity in Alexandria because I'm working on a book on Alexandria. I think that the other talks, I wouldn't say, I mean, maybe my talk isn't accessible, but I think that if you're interested in early Christianity, early Christian history, you can come get what you can out of it, and you can meet me, and I can get to know you. So, yeah, come along if you'd like.
Thank you so much for that, and I really appreciate the support. Mr. James Lowery, who is to say that the biographies attached to Julius Caesar and Augustus in the context of the Roman imperial cult were not equated with the religious, literary material and figures of their time?
I don't know anyone who's saying that, I guess.
Yeah, I'm a little bit fuzzy on equated with, but
yeah, right.
I think that pretty much a lot of people would recognize that if we're talking about Suetonius here or another biographer, that he's incorporating lots of mythic material. If that's what's being said here.
But Suetonius is also suspect about the role of the deities, with the emperors. So it's, it's a tricky one to answer, I think.
Sure.
Thank you, guys. I email me. I can always forward it if you have a more extensive way of elaborating what you're trying to get at, and I'd be happy to forward it to these gentlemen. And when they have the time, or maybe in a follow-up episode, that it'll be something to bring up. So I really appreciate your super chat, and thank you. John Gear, thank you so much for the super chat. Can you discuss the idea of Christianity being a mystery cult? And I just posted Dennis MacDonald's link to get his books. Do not let yourself down. Trust me. You want to be saved from eternal damnation? Get a book. All right. Anybody, mystery cults, Christianity?
Go ahead, David.
Well, I think in some ways, Christianity is a mystery cult. If we define that broadly enough, where a mystery cult is any Greco-Roman cult that involves a process of initiation and secret information. And I would say most of the early Christian varieties, and there's quite a panoply here, but most of them had a rite of initiation, actually a double rite of initiation, and that they withheld certain information until you had gone through the that rite of initiation, which was typically some form of baptism. They didn't tell you everything. And actually, they still don't. You still need to be catechized to a certain extent. And then they don't call them mysteries anymore. They call the sacraments mysteries in the Catholic tradition. But essentially, what a mysterion would be in the Greco-Roman world is something that typically you see acted out, but it is also a story or a narrative that you see as a kind of sacred drama after being initiated, and this information then helps you soteriologically. That is, it gives you good hopes for your own life and afterlife.
Thank you. I appreciate it. We got quite a few more I'm trying to get through. We only have 14 minutes max. I mean, literally max. So don't super chat any questions, please. I'm asking you. And if I miss out on that, I am going to have to be very quick on that. They can't stick around. To both, could it be that writers thought people should live as though the stories are true, so pretending was necessary?
I don't know that I would say pretending is necessary. I think what David and I may disagree on, what does it mean the stories are true? The very fact that they're myths means that for somebody, the stories are meaningful. And so therefore, truth can be conveyed in fiction. I think David is a little more sanguine about gospel stories being historically reliable. Not that they are, but they're portrayed that way. But I think we are hampered in the modern world to think that for a story to be true, it has to be historically true. Whereas in antiquity, and I think David has shown this in his book, for the stories to be true, they have to be satisfying to the reader and in a meaningful communication of value.
Yeah, but I would also say that even in the ancient world, there was a certain conflation between historical reality and truth value. That's very much emphasized for us after the Enlightenment. But I think it's still with people, and it's what makes Lucian funny. That
Right.
he says that these stories are so ridiculous. How could anyone believe that they really, really happened? And I'm going to show you how ridiculous they are, and laugh at you the whole time. But yeah, I do think that the gospel writers definitely wanted you to accept their stories as true. So for me, that means on some level historical. And I'm not making any commitment whether they are historical, but I think that that's what they wanted you to believe.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it, guys. Mr. James Lowry, thank you for the 20, man. Everybody's been hooking us up tonight. What are your thoughts on the fact that the earliest writings attributed to Paul come from Marcion, whose headquarters were in Asia Minor, the main epicenter of the Roman imperial cult, as were all of Paul's visitations? What are your thoughts? Maybe we start with you, Dr. Litwa, since you're big on Marcion and I really enjoy this.
I love Marcion. I've done a lot of work on Marcion. And it's just not true that the earliest writings attributed to Paul come from Marcion.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
Yeah, so I don't know what to make of this, but it is true that it is true, I think, or at least true in terms of what we can reconstruct of the history, and history is always a reconstruction. It always involves hypotheses here. So let's just be careful. But yes, Paul did work from Asia Minor, and yes, Asia Minor was a huge epicenter of the imperial cult. And so Paul would have known the imperial cult very, 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 very well. And so would Marcion. This is their oxygen that they are breathing in all the time. The imperial cult is one of the most important and widespread of all cults during their time. And that's an absolute fact, which is completely invisible to us today. unless, of course, you go to the archaeology sites. So that should always be kept in mind.
If I may, since you guys are in cooperation on this one, just what is the earliest source? Because I've been told Marcion's the first to discover Paul's letters at all.
No, I mean, Ignatius knows of a collection of Paul's letters, and in fact, he imitates them as far as we can tell.
When would you put Ignatius's dates?
Oh, about 117.
That's contested. I put Ignatius mid-2nd century, but I think First Clement, the Epistle to Diognetus, Second Clement, even some of the Nag Hammadi material. I think there's Paul in the Gospel of Thomas, which is early 2nd century. So, there's just so much interaction with Paul prior to what we know of Marcion.
One more statement about the Roman imperial cult. One has to avoid what some have called hidden transcripts in Paul, as though Paul was giving an alternative to the imperial cult, but he couldn't be public about it because he'd get in trouble. Those kinds of conspiracy theories I don't think are helpful as a rule. On the other hand, we need to be sensitive to how important the imperial cult was at the time. And there may be things that we've missed, but I wouldn't want to be, I think there's a danger of over-interpreting these hidden scripts.
Thank you so much, gentlemen. JM for the super chat at 5. Thank you so much. You will be going to heaven for that one. Let me see where we at here. Apollo, the god himself. Thank you for joining in here. I know they want to know what you guys are up to. I mean, they're sick and tired of sitting on Mount Olympus. I'm sure they're sick of it. But it's good to see you here, my friend. I really appreciate seeing you. And thank you for that support. Sobek is back. Gentlemen, I think there can be a compromise to your approaches. Love your work. Apes together strong. Love you too, Sobek. Thank you so much for the super chat and the constant encouragement, all the compliments, everybody in the chat. Sid Dave, on the last one, is there any influence? I wasn't going to ask any questions, but I'll ask it anyway real quick as we're exiting. This is it. No more after this. Is there any influence of Zoroastrianism on Christianity? Were the Magi Zoroastrian priests? I know it is a myth, but is there a reason for Christians to do it? And while you do that, I'm going to pop some stuff on the screen while you're answering.
Well, I mean, I don't know what Dennis thinks, but I think, yes, absolutely. That's in the Magi story. The Magi are Zoroastrian priests, I think, or at least they could be viewed as that. Magos comes to have a fairly flexible meaning by that time we get to the 1st century, but I think the Magoi are presented positively, and usually in that positive interpretation they appear in their more or less Persian priestly role, and the fact that they're coming from Persia, they're not local, I think is a great sign of that in Matthew. There's but for Matthew, I think like he wants you to believe that Magi actually came to see Jesus. I don't think he's just playing around. He wants you actually to believe that. Whether or not that happened, I don't know. But what is much more interesting is always the mythicization question, and this is the key story where you do see, I think, some influence, maybe not direct, but it's there, and it's a Hellenic writer looking at Hellenized version of Zoroastrian priests and what he thinks that they're doing astrologically. Whether Zoroastrian priests would agree with the author of Matthew, I don't know, but that's what we have.
Thank you so much for that. If I may, as we get into this, I'm going to have both of your gentlemen answering some of these questions here. Let me see. It's saying I don't have permission to share the screen. What the heck? All right, let's start one at a time then. We'll do this. Dr. Litwa, tell us about your Patreon, if you may.
Well, I highly encourage everyone to join. I've got 2 series up there. One is the Found Christianity series based on my recent book, and the series that I'm working on now is the Nag Hammadi series. So you're going to get essentially the equivalent of 2 courses that I would give to any academic audience. You've also got academic articles, you've got a full book, and you've got all of my videos, from the past 5 years. So you're getting quite a bit, and so I hope you'll come join.
I need to step my game up. Look at this. I'm locked out. You're telling me that I have to make multiple initiations in order to actually get to the point where I can see the truth of everything. Let's get this number up to 50 if we can. I'd like to look at this tonight and see this hit 50 patrons. I say that because you're part of the family, and so that kind of support is awesome. You can join for as little, what is it, $2 and something, $3, something like that. I can't remember, but
$250 US. Yeah, that's the initial initiation. Yeah. So,
and they can write you. Do you actually check your messages and things?
Absolutely. No, everyone who's on tier 3, I check every day. And so if you've got a question, I answer very promptly. And I love doing that because that's, for me, it's part of my teaching function. So I welcome that.
You also have mini books. I hope everybody goes and gets. We talked about Becoming Divine earlier last week, I believe. Earlier this week, I think it was. My days are mixed up with Dr. Tabor. And that was pertaining to Paul's divinization. And of course, Found Christianities is the latest in a direct kind of opposition, kind of sort of, to Dr. Bart Ehrman's Lost Christianities. And I hope people will go get them a copy. The Evil Creator was really fun. Definitely. Now, Dennis MacDonald has more books than I'll ever be able to read. And I really hope, I'm saying that exaggerated. I mean, it will take a long time to get through the material. Dennis, tell us about your work and your upcoming new work that's coming, if you don't mind.
Derek, thank you. I'm so excited about this project. It's 3 volumes that will be compressed into 2. The first one is a mimetic synopsis of the Synoptic Gospels that includes my reconstruction of Q in the earliest column, and then does all the synoptics. But it frequently has long introductions and excursuses on my translation of Greek poetry that I suspect has influenced it. And it's intended, and by the way, every word in the synoptics appears in my translation of it. And it's intended to be a reference work without bludgeoning the reader, and just to put the intertext in front of them and have them make their own associations. The second volume is what I call a mimetic synchrosis of the Acts of the Apostles, where I identify potential classical Greek poetic into some of the Platonic Socratic dialogues that Luke may have used in the crafting of the Acts of the Apostles. The third volume is believe it or not, a synopsis of the Gospel of John, in which I tease out 3 different compositional strata and argue that the first one is a Dionysian gospel, and compare it to Dionysus in the Bacchae. And this goes back to a question that I didn't weigh in on mystery religions. Christianity does have mystery religion potential, and the 4th gospel is full of that kind of thing. But it's not clandestine. There's an eagerness to share the mystery widely. And so I think that's actually worth exploring. But in any case, within a year, I'm certainly going to be able to publish these 3 volumes and make them available cheaply. And soon after that, I'm going to make it publicly available as a free PDF. And so every word in the Gospel of John is represented. All of the synoptics are represented. And the places where the Acts of the Apostles may be evoking, especially imitating classical Greek literature, will be there for one to appreciate. I think this is intended, for me, it's intended to lubricate the way for the next generation to have as much fun playing with these texts as I have in my lifetime.
Wow, there's a lot. I'd love to see you guys, as time goes by, engage more in this together and find things you might agree with and disagree with, and like have these conversations, because you have been a pleasure doing this tonight, and we're at 49 Patreons. Patrons? Can we get one more at least? One more, please. I'm serious. I really appreciate everybody. Those who already joined. It means a lot to me that people are actually into this stuff and they want to know, because these are, as much as people will use some of this stuff as hammers and weapons, you gentlemen, I'm sure maybe know a little bit, but the world I live in, these are as great as shields to protect one against the ridiculous apologetics that come knocking on your door, to give you way more depth and to say, my friend, I don't think you cherish this literature the way that I do. I think you should sit down and listen to me, because I think there's some things I could tell you that would just blow your mind. But I'm afraid they're infants and they're thinking and they're not able to understand the depth that this really goes. So anyway, enough of me lambasting the apologist. I do that enough. I want everybody to know right now I have a Patreon. I work very hard. I'll do a quick plug if you don't mind me doing that. Just so you know, the latest one I just launched was with a student of Dr. Dennis R. MacDonald, Michael Koshnosh. And we talk about the Book of Acts and how it uses this character we call Aeneid. The first thing he does is show you how rare that name is in antiquity, and how having that name come up, it's like me making the mention of Michael Jordan. What do you think of? Basketball. Aeneid, Rome comes to mind. The next person in this Acts narrative is Tabitha, who's brought back to life. And then he gets into Cornelius. And he wants to paint this narrative to show you, not only is it harping back to the Jonah story in this Acts 9 through 11, but it's making a big, like, direction of an aim at Rome being the goal, the massive empire that they lived in, and Christianity was going to conquer it. So there's a lot here. That's just one video, and there's so many videos I have that I work very hard. Consider helping support us here. Enough about me. I do want to tease everybody as we're on our way out, letting these gentlemen go. There is a video about to go live right now on Gnostic Informants channel, and that video is When Prophecy Failed. Dr. Robert M. Price. He's literally he's going live right now. There's people over there. If you will leave here as we're speaking live, I'll send a link in the audience right now. And please go over there. Everyone watching right now, you don't want to miss this. Neil's been bragging about it all day. He said it's going to be amazing. There's the link down there in the chat. 205 people watching. Leave this live and go support my friend, my brother, Neil, who's in the same fight of trying to make beauty out of this and yet give you the truth. So, with that being said, I'm talking over Dr. Price at the same time. All right, enough of that. Final words, gentlemen, as I let you go.
No, this. I hope we can have this conversation again.
Absolutely. Thanks to all for coming.
Thank you, Dr. Litwood. Let me know if we hit that 50 in a few minutes. I'd hope to see that. And Dr. MacDonald, let me know when the book comes out. I love both of you gentlemen. Keep doing the fantastic work you do. And ladies and gentlemen in the audience, if you're lost, you don't know where you're going, you just took the second initiation, and now you know we are
MythVision.
MythVision.